Well, here we are in the third week of the class, Leslie, and this week you shifted from faith to film.
First 2 weeks, we went back to the first week, just a reminder, a little review. We talked about the Christian imagination and really why it is the way it is in this modern world. I went into a little history diagram and really an important lesson on understanding why we think the way we do.
Right.
And then last week, we began looking at how to see through, along and through, versus looking at. I talked about C.S. Lewis's meditation in a tool shed, and just a whole way, a new way of seeing. And then I tried to give the class some ideas for looking along and through.
Right.
We talked about the hero's journey, the three parts of the story: creation, fall, and redemption. Sacrificial love, love triumphing over death.
Right.
So those were like new lenses that I wanted them to try and put on when they read something or when they saw something.
Right.
So today, we're going to be looking at film and looking at movies and trying to have these lenses on and look along and through at the movies.
Right. Well, you opened with an example about the power of imagery.
Yes, I did, because I wanted them to see the power of imagery in movie. I mean, because it is phenomenal. So I did this little experiment. I used an example from Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol, something everyone would be familiar with. And I read them the portion out of the book where Scrooge is confronted by the ghost of Christmas future. And seeing his grave. And that's such an incredible scene. So I showed them, after reading it, I showed them the new scene in the Robert Zemeckis' new animated Christmas Carol with Jim Carrey, I think is the star. And it is such a powerful scene. I mean, it is worth watching the movie for. And so I wanted to give them this contrast in just reading it and then seeing this image, because once you see this image, you never see it the same way again. And I wanted to read you this quote, Anne, because it says, I love this quote from Darrell Johnson. He says that imagery has the power to go deeper than mere words, which is what I was showing them. Imagery goes beyond the intellect and through the emotions into the imagination, grabbing hold of us at the deepest recesses of our being. So imagery
is really powerful.
Is really
that's what
powerful.
You're saying.
Yeah, yeah, it is.
And you had talked about Ken Geyer.
Oh, yes. Yes, Ken Geyer wrote a book on the movies called Reflections on the Movies. He's a Christian author and gave some really good points about the movies. He said that the film today is the medium of the masses. It's really like the Koine Greek that the Bible was written in, the common, ordinary, everyday language. And so when you hear people talking out there, you'll hear them talking about the movies.
Right.
You know, and I've had lots of fun, you know, talking about movies or film when I'm exercising or in a store or on an airplane or in a movie. You just start talking with someone and they'll say, well, did you see this? And then you go on. It really is a language that people need to understand. And he says in there, in his book, that the films do three things: that they entertain, obviously, bring joy, that they enlighten, that you can learn things in films, and obviously that's true, and then that you can have a moment of epiphany, like where the Holy Spirit just touches you with something. That imagery, again, goes deep and touches you in a place and says something to your heart.
Right.
So have you ever had that happen?
Oh yeah, many times. When I was really young, one of the most powerful moments for me was watching To Kill a Mockingbird. And immediately Scout and Jem and their dad Atticus Fitch became heroes for me because of the way that they confronted the ugliness of racism with grace and with dignity. And they became role models for me and really changed the course of my life in some ways.
Yeah. I had one with Gone with the Wind, you know, that scene where Scarlett O'Hara shakes her fist.
Right.
You know, it's God is my witness, I'll never go hungry again. And I've had one recently, well, I have them a lot, but I mean, in the King's Speech, I was deeply touched by that movie. And I just was deeply touched. But I think that's because you and I were looking along and through versus at.
Right.
You know, you were willing to enter in, and that's another point that Lewis makes, not in Meditation in a Tool Shed, but in a book he wrote on criticism.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah. He says that you need to really open yourself up, surrender before a piece of artwork. Let me read you this quote because it's important that I quote him right. He says, "We sit down before the picture in order to have something done to us, not that we might do things with it. The first demand that any work of art makes on you is surrender." It's in an experiment in criticism that he says that. And I think that's really important because a lot of people just come to a movie or a piece of art and they sit there judging it. They stand outside of it. They look at it.
And they don't enter in.
That
word surrender might be tough for some folks.
Right. The word surrender, exactly. But what he's saying is you have to be willing to open up. That's what surrender means. And to be willing to go in and see what the creator is saying, the person who wrote the story or the person who made the film, and see what they're saying rather than standing outside judging it. And that can be hard, but I think with Christians, they may go with defenses and walls up. And what Lewis is saying is you will never get anything from that. You won't be touched by it. You'll always just have your own presuppositions and your ideas about it. And that is really, in that book, he's not talking about ways of criticizing something. He's talking about two different kinds of people. And those two are the ones that look at versus those who are willing to look along and through. Very interesting, very good book. But so with film, when we enter in all sorts of things, but I think this is something that Christians can be guarded about. And they want their nice little, G-rated stories. And truth isn't always G-rated. I mean, I think of Scripture, Anne. I mean, there's this passage in Judges 19 with this concubine, and I think, what do we do with that? It is, if it's not R-rated, I don't know what it is. Or the rape of Tamar. There's just lots of places in the Bible that if you were to put that on the screen, it would be R-rated, but it's truth.
It is truth.
And
so the G-rated things you were saying are not really truth necessarily.
Well, not necessarily, because a lot of times you'll see these little films and they're put out and they're distributed as an inspirational film or a faith film, and they make everything look like it always works out.
So they don't require you to enter in.
Right. And I love what Geyer says, because he says, I'd rather have an R-rated truth than a G-rated lie.
That is really good.
And I think that's really the point.
Right.
There's truth in stories and there are lies, but you've got to be willing to look at and discern.
Right. Well, so let's get on with looking along and through. Tell me why, out of all the movies, you chose Titanic and Avatar as your main focus. Are they your favorite movies?
No. I mean, Titanic was at one time, not now. But I chose them because they are the highest grossing films of all time. I mean, it didn't take Avatar very long to surpass Titanic, which is surprising. But they are the #1 Avatar, #2 Titanic, the highest grossing films ever. I mean, out of all the movies.
Wow.
So that's why I wanted to talk about them, because we need to be looking at the deeper question here. The deeper question is, what is touching the hearts of people that takes them over and over and over again to see these films?
So people are voting with their feet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. They go and they see it not once, but 5, 6, 7, 8 times.
So what is it that's taking people?
Well, I think that there's deep messages in them, and if you just look at them, you don't see it.
Right.
When years ago I was at a church, and I had just seen Titanic. It had just come out, and I was just beginning to get all of these insights on it, and I was so enraptured with it that I was teaching some class. Don't remember what class it was now. I have no clue. But it was some Bible class or something. And I got so excited because I could weave in that night teaching on Titanic. And you know, for years, that was the only class people would come up to me and say, I was in your class on Titanic. And I thought, all these years I've been teaching, but you remember Titanic.
I wonder, is it, you think that's what made it so memorable? Is
well,
that?
Because the Titanic itself has a mystique about it. So it's not just the movie. First, we have to deal with the mystique of the Titanic.
The actual
itself,
history,
the actual event, because it was this major, major event like the world had never seen. But Titanic has a place in history that's really important to understand. We talked that first night about this sacred secular split, the Renaissance and the Reformation, and coming out of that, the modern world after the Age of Enlightenment and the scientific discoveries. And the Victorians had this dream that it included God at that point, that they would they thought the answer was now God was giving these discoveries and this technology, and that man was to take it and to use it to make things better for the world, make life better. And so it started out that way, and then by 1912, it had really gotten to the Gilded Age, where it had just become mere acquisition. God was no longer in the picture, and it was just acquiring more and more and more. It was all about wealth and money. And you have the age of the robber barons and this time of extreme wealth. And so the Titanic comes along at that point, and it's this image of what is the opulence, the most gigantic, the Titanic, even the name. And it had a sister ship, the Olympic. And they were going to be the greatest, the largest, the most opulent,
state-of-the-art,
everything that had ever been. And so then you have that, and then you have this disaster, which is, in essence, it's like, I want to say, a metaphor for the world. You know, the Titanic, really, with its 3 decks and its class system, was a picture of the modern world. And here it is, floating along on this sea, and then the disaster. And really, the 20th century comes as that disaster. I mean, more wars and blood in that century.
Almost foreshadowing, wasn't it?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
so to understand that event, and then you take this love story over it.
Right. Well, let's look at the trailer then.
Okay, yeah. Just a movie. So I want to take you into some of the ways of seeing along and through with Titanic. Not spend a lot of time, but maybe just look at it a little bit. You have the story of Rose, who's in great bondage as she gets on the Titanic. You probably remember that scene. I mean, her clothes, and she's got her boyfriend or fiance, Cal, who is figuratively like the devil, and her mother, who is very much like the world, wanting to squeeze life out of her, wanting to, you know, there's that scene where she's tightening her stays, her corset, and wanting Rose to do what she will for their financial gain. So it's like the world. And Rose is the beauty, and then you have Jack, who comes on, and I love the scene where he comes leaping and bounding onto the Titanic,
Right.
onto the third deck, wins his ticket and gets on, and he's the lowly guy, the humble one, the artist,
Right.
The creator kind of, that comes on. But there's that scene where he goes on the bow, and the dolphins are with him, and he says, "I'm king of the world." And dolphins are always, with a ship, are always a symbol of Christ and the church.
Huh.
So it's a neat picture. And but anyway, he rescues her. It's a sacrificial love story,
Right.
is what it is.
The end scene is so key.
Oh, it is. It is. I mean, James Cameron, he really came up with instead of leaving them in the water. When my daughters wanted me to go see Titanic, I said, no, I know how that movie ends. I don't want to see it.
Oh, that's great.
But this was so amazing that, Hollywood, and here's what people need to see. In that end scene, they are seeing the grand restoration.
Right.
Because Jack tells Rose, he says, "You're not going to die here this night. You're going to die an old woman warm in your bed." And that's exactly what happens in that last scene. You see the photographs of her, and she's lived the life that he purchased for her. And that he told her, what she was going to do.
Right.
And then she's in her bed all warm, and she dies. That's what happens in that scene. And then it goes not into a dream, but it goes into the grand restoration.
Right.
And there she is, the bride in her white gown, coming in and meeting him up at the top. And what I love about that scene is that everyone in that scene that is standing around applauding are those that died in the water.
Right.
There's not a person there that got into the boat, into one of the boats, and except for Rose, of course. And she said, just prior to that, she said that the ones who got into the boats, went on to tried to receive absolution, but it never came.
Never came.
It never came.
Wow.
So they're a picture really of the lost, whereas the ones who died in the water are the redeemed. And it's like this grand restoration, because it's the Titanic all comes back to its beauty. So it's like a picture of what God's going to do when he restores the earth in Revelation 21 and 22. I mean, that's what you're seeing. And that's what your heart just is so touched by it, because you want that to happen.
Right.
You
No
really
wonder
do.
it was the highest grossing movie.
Exactly.
When you look at it in terms of that. And
Yeah.
now Avatar has even broken its record. And it's
Avatar's-
another love story.
It is. It's another love story, but it has a lot of different things going on. It has this, really, it's a contrast between two worlds. And you have the Na'vi that live on Pandora, and Pandora means all gift. I love that. I love that.
That's wonderful.
And then you have the human beings from Earth that have come to Pandora, who are acquiring,
Right.
raping the planet
Right.
for their acquisition and their materialism. And so really what
It's the same theme, isn't it?
It's the same thing, but in a unique way, because the Na'vi, what he's done with this tribal people, really is he's given you a picture of what human beings were designed to do originally in the Garden of Eden.
Wow.
I mean, that not look like that,
Right.
but what they were to do, how they were to be, how they were to function.
Had the fall never occurred.
Had the fall never occurred. And then he's given you the picture of fallen mankind in the humans that have come from Earth. And so that's the deep contrast there. I don't want to read all of that now, but the notes for it are on the Movie Glimpse site, and I've got all of that written out, because really the earth was given to us as all gift. It was God's gift. And we were meant to have dominion over it, to exercise a beautiful stewardship over the earth, being God's vice regents. And we were to take care of the animal kingdom,
Right.
and the plant kingdom, not to rule over one another. And with the fall, all of that went, you see. And And so there's this incredible deep message in that movie. People look at it and say paganism, but it's not really. There's a deeper message that's beyond that. And then there's the hero story. You have Jake Sully coming, and he inherits his brother's life. His brother dies, and so he gets this new life. And he comes in weakness with his legs. He has no use of his legs at the beginning. And then he gets his avatar, and he goes on this journey. And I just want to read a few of these thoughts to you from the notes. But he's, you know, he comes in weakness, and he's humble. But he has a gorgeous brain, they say. But he's stripped of his weapons in that one scene, and he falls into the water, and that's like a baptism scene. And then he's raised to this new life. And the sign descends, marking him out, you see.
Right.
And then he goes through a time of trial and testing. And then he's accused of a betrayal. And then he dies in the ashes, and then he conquers the one that he has to conquer and comes in on the big dragon. He's conquered it. And so it's this beautiful hero journey that's woven over the love story.
Right.
So you have all of these things. You have deep messages, really deep Christian messages, believe it or not, if you take it back to God's large meta story. Yeah, the meta narrative that we live in. And so that is what's really touching people's hearts. That's why they're going to see it. Because deep within, it says in Ecclesiastes 3:11 that God has set eternity in our hearts. And there's this knowledge, this deep knowledge of something, a memory that we have long ago of Eden. And I think that's where people are really being touched by Avatar.
I love the quote you gave by Evelyn Underhill.
Yeah. Yes, yes. Evelyn Underhill said that every human being is looking for three things, okay? They're looking for a heart, a perfect soulmate. They're looking for a journey to go out on, an adventure, a pilgrimage, looking like for their lost El Dorado, you know. And they're looking for an inward purity. An inward purity. See, those are the things that were lost in Eden.
Right.
You know, and every one of us has that desire. And so you see beauty, intimacy, and adventure right there. And Titanic and Avatar have it. They're loaded. They're filled with it. They're filled with it.
I love that. Beauty, intimacy, and adventure.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. So next week we're going to move on to fiction.
Next week we move on to fiction. We're going to look kind of at fiction in a general way. I think it's going to be very informative and fun. We're going to use some clips. And then we'll unpack that in the following weeks, looking at fantasy and fairy and coming back to faith.
Great. Well, this has been fun.
It has.